The Sermon on the Mount, the message of Jesus in Matthew 5. Why is this passage so important? When Jesus spoke these words, he was bringing something radical for his time, and also for ours. In a world accustomed to rigid rules and superficiality, he revealed a profound truth. The kingdom of God is for everyone, but it requires living in a different way. Throughout this sermon, Jesus not only taught, but he also challenged, inspired, and opened doors to a new understanding of how we should relate to God and others. What does this mean for you? It may be the answer you have been seeking to transform your life. Let's discover it together. Introduction to the context of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is one of the most iconic moments in the life of Jesus, recorded in chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew. It took place in a simple setting, outdoors, where Jesus chose to teach a crowd of followers. But why this setting instead of a great temple? Perhaps Jesus wanted to show that his words were for everyone, accessible to anyone, regardless of social status. Those who gathered to hear him did not expect to hear the deep truths he was about to reveal. The content of the sermon wasn't just a list of rules. It brought a new way of looking at life. The people present were used to teachings that focused on strict adherence to the law. However, Jesus surprised everyone by presenting something much deeper. He spoke about the heart, the intention behind actions. Throughout the sermon, Jesus prompted his listeners to reflect on their daily attitudes, not just as mechanical law-keeping, but as a path to inner transformation. Imagine being in that crowd, hearing these words for the first time. The setting was simple, but Jesus' words were revolutionary. He not only challenged the belief system of the time, but also brought a message that resonated with the deepest desires of each person, to live a fulfilled life in the kingdom of God. Each teaching was a surprise, as if he were revealing hidden secrets, something that few had understood until then. Jesus marked a turning point with this sermon, and its impact goes far beyond that moment. He opened a new chapter in the understanding of faith and human relationships. But what makes this message still so relevant today? This is what we are about to start discovering through Jesus' words, beginning with the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes. Who are the blessed? The Beatitudes are one of the most well-known parts of the Sermon on the Mount, and rightly so. Here, Jesus flips the logic of the world, calling blessed those who, according to society's standards, were often overlooked or despised. The word blessed can be translated as happy, but it's not superficial happiness. It is a deep joy, knowing that you're on the right path. Jesus is teaching that true happiness does not come from material achievements, but from a heart aligned with the values of the kingdom of God. When Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," he is speaking about much more than financial poverty. He's talking about humility, recognizing that we are dependent on God. Society often values self-sufficiency, but Jesus highlights that true wealth lies in knowing we need something greater than ourselves. He continues, praising those who mourn, the meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, people who, in the world's eyes, are the last, but in the kingdom of God, are the first. These teachings are so counterintuitive that they may seem strange at first. After all, who would say that those who suffer persecution are blessed? But Jesus explains that these people, despite their difficulties, are in tune with God's purposes and therefore deeply happy. This kind of happiness is something the world cannot take away, for it is rooted in something greater, communion with the Creator. And so, Jesus reveals that the kingdom of God is for all who are willing to follow this path. He excludes no one but calls everyone to transformation. After showing us who the truly blessed are, he challenges us to become something even greater, the salt of the earth and the light of the world. The call to be salt of the earth and light of the world. After describing who the truly blessed are, Jesus makes a powerful call to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Salt and light are common elements of daily life, but they carry deep meaning. Salt preserves and adds flavor to food, just as followers of Jesus are called to preserve the values of the kingdom of God and make a difference in the world. Light, on the other hand, drives away darkness, and we are challenged to shine in the midst of darkness, bringing God's truth wherever we go. But what does this mean in practice? Being the salt of the earth is more than just living a religious life. It is being a positive influence in any environment we are in. At work, at home, in friendships, in every small action, we can be examples of God's love. For example, someone who acts with integrity at work, even when no one is watching, is being salt. Someone who chooses to forgive instead of holding a grudge is being light in a world where hatred and resentment are common. This responsibility of being salt and light is not easy. Often, the world prefers darkness over light, and those who try to shine may face resistance. However, that is precisely why Jesus makes this call. He knew the world needed people who would go against the grain, who would not be afraid to be different and carry the message of the kingdom of God boldly. Now that we understand the call to be salt and light, Jesus takes us to a deeper reflection on the law and the importance of understanding its spirit, not just its letter. The new interpretation of the law, not just the letter, but the spirit. Jesus came to fulfill the law, but he made it clear that it wasn't about blind obedience to the letter of the law, but about understanding the spirit behind it. This was one of the most challenging points of his sermon, because many of his listeners were used to a rigid system of rules. However, Jesus taught that fulfilling the law begins in the heart. It's not enough to simply follow the rules outwardly. The heart must be aligned with the principles of love and justice that God desires. For example, he speaks about the commandment, "You shall not murder," but goes further by saying that whoever is angry with their brother is already violating that principle. To Jesus, hatred is just as harmful as the physical act of killing. Similarly, when talking about adultery, he says that even impure desire corrupts the heart. Here, Jesus teaches that sin is not just a matter of action, but of intention, and that true obedience to God begins long before any visible action. Modern society is not much different. We often focus on appearances, on following social norms, but Jesus calls us to look deeper, to examine our motivations. Are we acting with integrity because we believe in what is right, or just to keep up appearances? He challenges us to go beyond what is expected and live with sincerity in every area of life. This understanding of the law opens the door to the next step in his message, which is overcoming hatred and practicing love for enemies. And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and like the video. Love for enemies and overcoming hatred. One of Jesus' most revolutionary teachings is the call to love your enemies. In the context of that time, this idea was completely absurd. The world's logic had always been one of retribution. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. However, Jesus presents a completely different path, the path of radical love. He challenges us to love those who harm us, to pray for those who persecute us, and to treat our enemies with kindness. This love is not a superficial feeling, but a decision to act with compassion, even when we don't feel like it. Jesus knew that hatred is a vicious cycle that consumes people from the inside. When someone repays evil with evil, they perpetuate this cycle. However, by responding with love, the chain of hatred is broken, and something new begins. In practice, this may seem impossible, but Jesus gives us the strength to love in a way that goes beyond the natural. For example, instead of returning an insult with another, he encourages us to seek understanding and peace. Loving our enemies does not mean agreeing with their actions, but deciding that we will not be controlled by hatred. When we choose the path of love, we free ourselves from the grip of resentment. This not only benefits those who have hurt us, but, most importantly, transforms our own lives. And here, we see how humility and a pure heart are essential to walk this path. The importance of humility and a pure heart. Jesus always emphasized the importance of a pure heart and an attitude of humility. In the world, it is common to see people seeking recognition and status, but Jesus teaches us the value of true humility. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. It is the ability to recognize our limitations and depend on God's grace. Throughout the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus exalts those with a pure heart, saying they will see God. But what does it mean to have a pure heart? Having a pure heart means living without masks, without duplicity. being authentic in our intentions and actions. In a world where many try to appear as something they are not, Jesus calls us to be transparent, to act with truth and sincerity. A pure heart does not seek the approval of men, but seeks the approval of God. This purity of heart is what allows us to live a life that reflects the kingdom of God, both in our words and in our actions. Being humble and having a pure heart is not an easy task, especially in a society that values pride and self-promotion. However, it is precisely this humility that opens us up to true transformation. Jesus shows us that by emptying ourselves of our ego and placing ourselves at God's disposal, we experience a fuller life. And now, how can we apply all these teachings in our daily lives? This is what we will explore next. How to live the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount today. The big question that arises after understanding all these teachings is, how do we live them in our daily lives? The Sermon on the Mount was not just a collection of good ideas. It is a practical guide for a transformed life. Living these teachings means choosing a different path, one that often goes against the prevailing culture. But how do we do this concretely in today's world? First, we can start with the simplest things, being light in small actions. At work, at home, in daily interactions, we can apply the principles Jesus taught. If we are called to love our enemies, this may mean responding with kindness when someone treats us poorly. If we are called to be the salt of the earth, it means being an example of integrity and kindness wherever we are. Transformation doesn't start with big gestures, but with small daily choices. Additionally, living the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount means having a heart attentive to the needs of others. In a society that values individualism, Jesus calls us to care for our neighbor, to be compassionate, and to seek justice for those who are oppressed. We can do this in various ways, from small acts of kindness to involvement in larger causes that reflect the kingdom of God. Now that we have seen how to apply these teachings in practice, you are ready to live a different life, a life in tune with the values of the kingdom of God. And as you follow this path, your life will never be the same. Now that you have heard this message, what will you do with this knowledge? The teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount are not just beautiful words. They are an invitation to a transformed life. Are you willing to put these principles into practice? How can you be salt and light where you are? What attitudes in your life need to change to align with the kingdom of God? Reflect on this and make the decision to be a different person, committed to truth and love. And don't forget, continue learning about what God has for your life. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join us on this journey of faith.